The British consider the conflict between them and their German and Italian enemies a European war fought in Africa. Then the allies of Great Britain, the Americans, joined the fray, disembarking their powerful force of men, vehicles, and supplies in North Africa to join the British in November 1942. They called it Operation Torch. Barely 6 months after disembarking in Africa, marching with groups gathered in an improvised prisoner of war camp, we were driven like cattle toward trucks. Once again, we were going to undertake a journey, but this time it was vitally important. Around me, the boys murmured worriedly, like turtles nibbling in a pond. "I got to know some." I murmured. I asked the guard, a boy named Bernard, and another boy added words of encouragement. "You seem harmless. With those antenna ears, maybe the guards won't hurt you." At that moment, I realized that I didn't care. I was no longer afraid of the British. I thought that the enemy had already done the worst to me. What more could they do? Risky by nature, I thought I could take advantage of the cultured English that I had learned at school. I made my way to the front and addressed the guard with perfect pronunciation and intonation. "Where are we going?" "To the port of Tunis," he replied dryly. "To the sea." I quickly translated to my companions. I couldn't believe my good luck, not even for a second. I smelled the intoxicating mixture of sweat on sunburnt skin and the salty sea air, which had been part of my childhood. Being near the sea again was almost like coming home. I couldn't wait to see the Mediterranean. My heart was beating with emotion, but then I refocused on the British guard in front of me. Reality hit me hard. This was not a summer vacation or a day trip to the beach. Whether or not it was the coast, this was war. An hour later, the transports left us at the port. It was obvious that they were going to move us somewhere by boat. I turned to take one last look at Tunis as we boarded the coastal freighter that had been assigned to us. "Where is this ship going?" I boldly asked the guard on board. "I wanted my friend to know that they could trust me to Algiers," he said. Totally disappointed, I told an old man named Tillman who was next to me. "We are going to another African country." "What did you expect?" Tillman scoffed. "Spain." German sarcasm at its finest. While they were fleeing, he and some others had hoped to requisition ships at Cape Bond. If we had reached Spain, the Spanish would have helped them return home. The Spanish government had emerged victorious from a civil war that ended in 1939 and had secretly reinforced its troops with German soldiers. Our guards, British soldiers, led about 100 of us to the ship's dungeon. The hatch resonated and banged over our heads as the guards closed it. "We are down here like a bunch of rats," said Tillman with his eyes wide with panic. His friend Frank interjected. "If one of our submarines torpedoes us, we won't have a chance. We will die like rats. We have no chance. We will sink like rats," replied an older man. "We have no submarines in the Mediterranean. Hitler does not consider this area important enough to deploy submarines," said the men around me, visibly relaxed. I didn't believe it. From what I remembered of Hitler's activities, he definitely considered this sea important. "How long do you think the trip will last?" Bernard asked me, huddled on the cold metal floor near me. "I estimate 1 or 2 days," I replied, trying to get comfortable against the war. Bernard had marched by my side and seemed fine until that moment. When our journey across the ocean began, he became taciturn. "What are they going to do to us?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling a little moody, "but we must be brave for the sake of our families." Bernard took out his wallet and showed me a photo of himself with some army buddies. "Those are my friends, and now they are dead," he said with tears in his eyes. He tore the photo to pieces. "I don't care about anything anymore." The freighter soon set sail, heading parallel to the Algiers coast. The ground became harder and colder as I tried to get away from the men who were seasick. It was ironic in a way that the rocking of the ship, which caused seasickness to the men, made me feel nostalgia. If I could have made a wish, I would have let my family know that I am okay. I prayed they would be okay too. Finally, we heard the propellers of the engines stop and the crash of the waves against the side. What awaited us in Algiers? Instead of the Americans we expected, armed British soldiers awaited us. "Where are we going?" I asked again in English for myself and my companions. "To a prisoner of war camp. Little Jerry," he said with a humorless laugh as the prisoners, some still vomiting, others helped by their friends, went down the gangway. Our British escorts organized us into rows. I took one last look at the sea before leaving for the desert again. We marched a lot when we were with the British, who did not have motorized vehicles, unlike the Americans. We called the British soldiers by the colloquial term they used for themselves, Tommies, while they made us march. The Tommies sang a song that was from a Scottish unit that wore a helmet with a red decoration on top. One verse went like this: What made the Germans run was not the Tommy machine gun, but the cherry on his cap, the damn cherry. Apart from rubbing our faces in their victory, the British were decent guys and allowed us to rest from time to time during the hot, all-day march to another camp. They often shared their water. We finally arrived at the kind of prisoner of war camp that became part of my life for the next few years. 2 rows of barbed wire and watchtowers. Before settling in, the British interrogated each prisoner. I later understood that they wanted to make sure that no high-ranking or dangerous prisoner went unnoticed during the registration process. When my turn came, an officer asked me for my soldier's book or soldier's notebook, a summarized personal record that contained data such as my weight, height, date, and place of birth, as well as the names and addresses of my parents and records of my vaccinations and eye exams. It also recorded my military training units, transfers, and functions. There was space for promotions, but mine was blank. My photo and signature were inside the cover. The officer reviewed my identification, as well as my rank and the type of unit I was in. Apparently, he concluded that I was neither dangerous nor high-ranking. He closed the notebook and returned it to me, saying, "That's all." I saluted, clicked my heels, executed a quick turn, and an even faster exit toward the latrine. My guts were churning. I was sick, dysentery, fever, dehydrated, and bleeding. I told a non-commissioned officer about my problem. Obviously, I needed medical attention, so he sent me to a British field hospital on the coast. I walked, of course, with 2 young British guards as escorts. The 3 of us were moving calmly, although I felt weak and shaky. I was having a pleasant conversation with one of them until the other nudged me in the ribs with his gun and said, "Give me your watch." I got scared. We were alone on a street in an unknown city. There was no one. No authority watching. In fact, I didn't even see any natives nearby. These soldiers could do whatever they wanted to me, and no one would care. I took off the expensive Swiss watch that my parents had given me when I turned 16 and handed it over. "Your wallet," he said. "Can I keep the photos of my family?" He nodded. My hands were shaking, but I took out the photos of my family and handed him the wallet. "Now the soldier's book," he said, and added with a sly look, "Where are your medals?" I was never given any. "I'm just a private," I told him. He frisked me and added, "Where are they?" he said, and then added with a sly look, "Where are your medals?" I never had any. "I'm just a private," I told him. He frisked me. He didn't find anything else. Reluctantly, I gave him my notebook. My meager possessions were now his trophies. His greed, my loss. I thought bitterly that, without personal identification, I felt like a nobody. Since childhood, I carried a wallet with my identification and enough money to return home. At 13 years old, I even carried membership cards from the Youth Association with my identity documents. Demonstrating who you were or who you were not had been a matter of survival in Hitler's Germany. People lived or died according to the integrity of their documents. Now I was very far from home, and for the first time, completely helpless, without proof of who I was or where I came from. My head hurt. I had cramps and discomfort. I wanted to get away from the trophy hunter and lie down on the hospital beds with their clean, soft sheets, which seemed like a piece of heaven. But just as I was settling in, a German submarine attacked the port, causing more injuries, which led to the evacuation of all non-critical cases from the hospital. I remembered that my companions in the ship's hold had convinced themselves that there were no submarines in the Mediterranean. During the evacuation, the British took me to a train station, and I found myself on a train controlled by the Americans that was heading west to Central Africa. On the train, I was surprised that I was treated as well as any Allied soldier. British and American military personnel also traveled on the train, as well as prisoners of war like me. Train. It seemed ironic to me that, as we passed through French Algeria, a friend of the Allies, the inhabitants of the towns waved French, British and American flags without knowing that they were also welcoming German prisoners of war. The prisoners of war disembarked in Oran, Algeria, and were transferred to an American field hospital, a quiet and orderly place that felt familiar. Seeing doctors administering medications and people convalescing had been part of my life since childhood. During my childhood, I had suffered from rickets, attributed to the hunger that my mother had gone through in starvation during the British blockade of Germany. In the First World War, in my hometown, rickets was commonly known as the British disease. My bones broke easily and healed slowly. My pediatrician, a kind and benevolent man who happened to be Jewish, used to say I had glass bones. Jaundice had been another problem that required my doctor's care. His treatment was successful, and the sickly child grew into a healthy teenager, so healthy that I passed all the military physical exams with good grades. I was thin, but I recovered from injuries and hardships with youthful vigor. In the American Field Hospital, I woke up one day feeling much better, but realizing that I had lost track of time. "What day is it?" I asked a friendly American nurse. "June 9th, 1943, she added to emphasize it, probably thinking that I had trauma from the bombing or something. I jumped up. "Wow. 2 days ago I turned years old, and I didn't even know it," I told her. "How old are you?" she asked me. "You look 14. 19, I replied proudly. "If you were at home, my mother would have made a birthday cake," I added, "and we would have celebrated a party," I told her as she walked away. I could see her slowly shaking her head. "Is it the war?" I asked. I proudly told her that if I were at home, my mother would make me a birthday cake. I added that the nurse turned around to leave and that we would have a party. I told her. Backing away, I could see her slowly shaking her head. Was it disbelief or sadness? No. Her painful reaction made me think that perhaps she was wondering why I had to be so far from home on my birthday, why all of us sick and injured boys, both from the Axis and the Allies, were so far from home. During my quiet and relatively comfortable convalescence, I too began to question it. What was I doing there? Why were we fighting? I had been obedient by training and by habit. I had done what I had been told, and I had marched. Well, they ordered me without asking questions. Now, suddenly, I realized that I couldn't let things keep happening. My survival depended on me. I had already exhausted much of my good luck or the grace of God, depending on how you looked at it. In 6 months of combat, the only wounds he suffered were infections from cactus thorns and scorpion stings on his legs and a small load of shrapnel on his back. Landing in an American hospital in relative luxury had exhausted my luck. I found myself recovering from dysentery much faster than I wanted. How could I delay my return to the prisoner of war camp? Desperate, I asked men who were sicker than me for their feces. "Do you want mine?" they asked and then smiled. "Go ahead, take as much as you want." Happily, they shared their liquid feces with me, which I needed for the daily lab tests. But by midsummer, I looked so healthy and strong that not even this deception worked. The doctor declared me healthy and discharged me from the hospital. The Americans sent me back to a prisoner camp in Iran, where tens of thousands of fellow prisoners have been transferred there by train. The enormous camp was the point of embarkation toward permanent captivity. To my surprise, we were guarded by black French African troops. The only black people I had seen in my life were some foreign sailors in my hometown. Like the sailors, the guards simply had a job and did it. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the white French officers. These officers, whose country had been defeated and occupied by Germany, clearly wanted revenge on us. Their personal grudge against us. They made it clear that they were going to make our lives as miserable as possible every day in the camp. The prisoners of war swayed in line during the long counts under the heat. Many prisoners collapsed, but somehow I grew stronger despite the heat and taunts. I found strength to face the adversity. God was still with me, and so was my family. I remembered their faces, their last goodbyes, and when he ordered me to go home with a dry throat and dust clogging my nostrils. I stayed in the wavering ranks of the count and encouraged the men next to me. Bend your knees, take a deep breath, think of the fresh mountain air. My father would have done no less. Later, in our tents, rumors circulated as we tried to get the latest information. I looked for Tillman, the old man from the freighter, who always managed to know what was going on. I joined a conversation he was having with his friend Frank. The British and Americans are trying to figure out how to make the most of all our labor. Deep furrows wrinkled Tillman's forehead. I guess they'll send us to work in their factories and farms very soon. What an inglorious end to the course of Africa, I thought then. Then I heard something alarming. They are going to hand us over to the French for the rest of the war, Frank said. I have heard some French guards talking about it. They're going to work us as slaves in their African mines. Tillman's horror mirrored mine. I knew something bad like this was going to happen. Tillman didn't seem so idiotic now. What a horrible fate for an old man, I thought. I wondered if he could survive. I wondered if I could. I want to look for my new friend Albert, whom I had met when we were patients at the American hospital. He was 20 years old, a quiet boy whose uniform was always impeccable and whose brown hair always looked perfectly combed. I crept up and quietly told him the rumor that he was going to suffer claustrophobia if he had to work in a mine. Albert nodded. Yes, I know, I don't want to spend any more time underground either. I didn't even like being in the trenches. There has to be a way out, I told Albert as we discussed this latest rumor about the French mining camps. Several times a week, the American roll call began. The Americans entered our French camp and read aloud a list of names of prisoners of war. The chosen men gathered at the front gate and boarded American Army trucks that we never saw again. American Army trucks, never to be seen again. I have heard a rumor that they are going to the United States, Tillman said. Wow, I thought, how have they been so lucky? And more importantly, how could I get some of that luck? It occurred to me when the Americans called the last German names. Albert, I whispered to him, you know how the French treat us, and you know how the Americans have treated us. He nodded enthusiastically. He knew I was plotting something. I could not help feeling a pang of emotion. Let's go with the Americans, I said. But are the guys whose names have been called really heading to the United States? Or are they going somewhere else? Albert was not stupid. We didn't have much time to decide. It was now or never. Let's do it, I said. He nodded with a resounding yes. A few days later, when the Americans read another list of names, Albert and I managed to stay near the group that was gathering. Although they didn't call our names, we casually joined the line of prisoners of war and mingled with them. We got on a truck with the others and were unloaded without incident at the port of Oran, where a fleet of Liberty ships was anchored. So far, so good, I murmured before looking up and seeing the guards begin searching the prisoners of war. It crossed my mind that perhaps it was a stroke of luck that my identification card had been stolen. The British had also taken it from Albert. Make sure you take everything shiny from them, said the sergeant of the guards. I whispered the translation to Albert. The guards took our canteens, cutlery, and mirrors, and through the metal fence, I saw the pile that was forming, and I thought, more trophies for the Allied noncombatants. The only thing left was the sweaty uniform on my back. They never asked us who we were. We went unnoticed. Why do they want shiny things? Albert asked later. Maybe they think we can use them to signal German ships. German submarines roamed the ocean like sharks in the fall of 1943. The nerves calmed, and the tension had dissipated. We made sarcastic comments about how absurd it was for a private to come into contact with them. Do you know any maritime code? Albert asked. No, and even if I did, I wouldn't want us to be torpedoed along with the other small group of selected prisoners. Albert and I boarded a freighter under the Norwegian flag. Marine, United States Navy destroyers escorted our large convoy of Liberty ships. Our captain made sure that each of us received a United States Army blanket, since we had to sleep on the metal floor of the hold. He announced the rules. Only 50% of us could be on deck during the day, and at night, we would be locked in the hold. There were no bathrooms, so it was a relief to go up on deck every morning. The stench below was nauseating. Once on deck, I was allowed to climb a ladder to get some fresh air and see the crew working. I spoke in English with the American guards, who seemed friendly. I asked them where we were and tried to figure our position by scanning the coast. In the afternoon, I stayed downstairs and tried to comfort Albert. The poor guy suffered terribly from seasickness and stayed downstairs most of the time. Albert had a litany of complaints when someone vomited. The African mines would have been a picnic compared to this. Why did you convince me? I wish I hadn't listened to you. Soon our ship was sailing near the Spanish coast. We must be approaching the Strait of Gibraltar, I thought. Screams in two languages resonated above me. Why did you convince me? I wish I hadn't listened to you. I listened to you. Soon our ship was nearing the Spanish coast. We must have been reaching the Strait of Gibraltar. Screams in two languages resonated above me. I hurried up the stairs and peeked out of the hatch. Bernard, the boy I had met on the freighter, was leaning over the railing for a better view. "What's going on?" I asked two of our men. "Dove has fallen into the water and is swimming towards Spain," said Bernard. "But they are not advancing much. The cross currents are too strong. They will probably drown." Cheers erupted from our men on deck. "What's going on now?" I asked. "A destroyer has spotted them and is throwing them life preservers." Cheers were heard. "They have grabbed on. They're pulling them aboard." More cheers. "Now they are fine," said Bernard. Albert was all ears. "I wish I had jumped overboard." He groaned, his face the color of the metallic floor. "I bet they'll be treated much better on that destroyer than us in this hole," I said. I had never seen anyone dive and vomit simultaneously. Albert rolled his eyes and leaned against the wall, turning his back on me. Poor Albert. I had never seen anyone dive and vomit at the same time, I said to him, giving him a playful tap on the shoulder. "Do you know how to swim?" "My God. Albert," he said, rolling his eyes and leaning against the wall, his back to me. Poor Albert. He was so physically weak that he could barely climb the stairs to get his water ration, let alone swim. He had lost a lot of weight because he could rarely eat. Our food consisted of cold, can't see rations. Pieces of wood from the packing boxes served as our spoons. We cleaned the empty food cans for the water that was thrown to us on deck. We had to drink what we could right there. Only an acrobat could climb vertical stairs with one hand and hold an open can of water with the other. However, the problems we had with food and drink were insignificant compared to the possibility of being dragged down by our own Navy, since the ship we were on was not identified as a German prisoner transport. We were as worried as the Americans about German submarines that might torpedo us. AGI told me that his troops needed entertainment to distract them from the danger and boost morale. He asked me if the prisoners of war who were doing their shift in the hold sang. It didn't occur to me at the time, but I later learned that the American sailors hoped that the German submarines could hear the lyrics and songs in German and therefore not attack when they realized that the ship was carrying a cargo of Germans. They realized it was true. Our songs may have saved our lives. One of the songs requested by the American GIS was that of the German Submarine Corps, which is sung fortissimo, a war song full of boom boom booms. The Americans also liked the African colonial song, Heya, Safari. How many times have we walked along narrow native paths through the steppe as the coolness of the afternoon approached? How do we listen to the sounds, the familiar songs of the carriers and the native Askari soldiers? Heya, Heya, Safari. Sometimes the Norwegian sailors also asked for the World War II version. They even asked us to sing the exciting song of the African Corps, but their favorite was the melancholy love song of Lily Marlene, discovered by German soldiers when they stormed a Yugoslav radio station in Belgrade. We sang it in German. The sailors knew it in English. Singing calmed us. We felt less nervous, especially when we sang at the top of our lungs. Even the soldiers seemed calmer as they listened to our choirs. They appreciated our music so much that they threw us candies and cigarettes from the deck after each song. Later, I realized that the rain of gifts was so we would continue singing. Our trip lasted longer during war than in times of peace, because the convoys sailed in zigzag to mislead submarines. Day after day, as soon as I touched the deck, I looked on the horizon for signs of land. We sailed for 3 exhausting weeks. Everyone cheered when they spotted seagulls, which indicated land was near. Our trip, which had put our nerves on edge brand new trip, was coming to an end. A huge statue of a woman with a tunic and torch appeared on the horizon, the Statue of Liberty. We mocked the German submarines with a last chorus of their song. I shouted the end with a thunderous roar. The inscription on the Statue of Liberty was too far for me to see, but I knew it said, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." My miserable bodies, and I fit the description. Homeless, yes, tempest-tossed, no doubt, and I would have given anything to free myself from our captors, from Hitler, and also from the German army, which had pulled the rug out from under us. The door to the United States was open, but I didn't feel very welcome when we finally disembarked at Ellis Island in New York. At Ellis Island, they took us to some showers with luxury foamy soap, thick clean towels, and hot water. They washed us, shaved us, and deloused us. They even gave us clean, new underwear. "Throw away the Nazi clothes," said a smiling guard while we scrubbed, cleaned, and disinfected our uniforms. It was more hospitality than we expected. I was glad to get rid of the dirt that covered me and eager to settle down somewhere. After cleaning ourselves enough, another guard pointed us toward a train. Albert and I got on the Pullman cars along with hundreds of other prisoners of war. Each of us had his own upholstered seat. Do you see how good the United States is? This is a great improvement over the German freight cars. I whispered it to Albert, who had returned to his old self, although a little weak, and he nodded. He was looking at the military police who were guarding each end of the car. They wore elegant uniforms and were fully equipped with machine guns. The police explained the rules to us. Stay seated, don't get up to walk, and raise your hand if we needed the bathroom. We may have felt like kindergarten children, but Albert and I were more comfortable than in months. In months, his dizziness had disappeared. The movement of the train did not bother him, and he could finally eat again. Some very polite black porters served us food. It may have been normal for Americans, but it seemed like a banquet to us. Fruit juice, hamburgers, French fries, and real coffee. A few days later, while I was eating and relaxing, I looked out the window and saw a sign that said Texarkana, a city whose name I recognized. "Look at that, Albert. I bet we're on our way to Texas." Albert's eyes lit up, and he pressed his nose to the window for a better view. We had both seen many movies of cowboys and Indians, and I had read many Western novels translated into English when I was a schoolboy. "Maybe this isn't so bad after all," Albert said. From my geography classes in elementary school, I remembered that Texarkana was on the border between Arkansas and Texas. The name had fascinated me. Indeed, our long train journey came to a crashing halt on a hot autumn day in 1943 in the small town of Herner, Texas. We got off the train in droves and marched to new barracks compound. The Americans gave us a warm greeting. "How are you? How are you?" They took us to the bathrooms so we could take a hot shower before serving us an American meal of potato salad, bread, hot dogs, carrots, celery sticks, and ice cream in the dining room. When we finished eating, the United States Army sergeant told us, "Now you're going to be processed." I quickly translated for the guys around me. "They want us to line up." I had been dreading it. "No doubt, if they captured us," United States Army sergeant said. "Now you're going to be registered." I quickly translated it to the guys around me. "They want us to line up." I had been dreading it, sure that if they were going to catch us, that would be the moment, but American procedure was far more informal than I imagined. When we arrived in the United States, the American Army had registered over 100,000 prisoners of war from the Axis, more than the total of American soldiers before the war. I did not have any identification. Would the Americans think I was trying to hide something? Should I tell them that British soldiers had stolen my German soldier book? I decided that the truth could worsen things. The Americans' process seemed the perfect place for a European criminal to create a new identity. I was worried that they would not try to separate Nazis from the rest of us. The heated political discussions that I heard on the ship convinced me that the Nazis still felt powerful, not only in Germany, but among us too. I could only hope that the Americans would understand that German prisoners of war had important political differences. As I moved forward in line, I worried even more. I realized that German-English interpreters were few and far between. The Americans did not know with whom they were dealing. I saw that they left the German military branches intact: the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. They followed the rules of the Geneva Convention and separated the officers from the enlisted men. So the most fanatical Nazis went unnoticed until they mutilated or killed fellow prisoners whom they considered disloyal or anti-Nazi. All I could do was wait and see what would happen. First, a typical Army medical exam, and then the assignment of a serial number for the rest of my internment. When I told the Americans that I was German and a veteran of the Rommel course in Africa, Captured in North Africa, I was assigned federal number 81 G285. My paperwork provided me with a basic 3-page personal file that I had to fill out with the same information that was on the one stolen from me in Germany. I later learned that copies of the numbers and forms were sent to the International Red Cross in Switzerland so that our families would be notified if something bad happened to us. Then they took our fingerprints and pictures of us. Then came the inventory of our personal effects. All I had left were the photos of my family, which to me were worth more than gold. The personal effects page was left blank. The last step of the process was the best. I was told to go to a supply window to pick up my new uniform. I could not believe that the duffel bag thrown over the counter to me was just for me. 4 pairs of pants, 2 cotton and 2 wool, 5 short-sleeve and long-sleeve khaki shirts, denim and wool, socks, underwear, gloves, a jacket, a coat, a raincoat, a cap, and new shoes. Albert was as happy as I was to have new clothes and eager to get to the barracks to put them on. A quartermaster sergeant said in very bad German, "In your barracks you will find white paint and a stencil with the letters PW. Paint the letters PW on your uniforms, on the back of your shirts and jackets, on the front of your pants, and on the sides of your shirts and pants." I wish I had paint them. Albert said, "Everything is so clean and fresh. Think of it this way, Albert. These are much better than the tattered and torn uniforms we left behind on our last retreat." "Yes," said a guy behind me, "and the white paint is a perfect target for American guards." "Your Teutonic mind is overloaded," I told the idiot. I thought, why would the Americans bring us here just to shoot us? In my naivety, I did not foresee how the interaction between common prisoners of war like us and the Nazis would clash with our young guards. They probably thought we all were Nazis. We were allowed to keep our German uniforms to wear inside the camp on holidays, in accordance with the rules of the Geneva Convention. As I washed mine and stored it at the bottom of my duffel bag, I thought I never wanted to see it again. Little did I know that I would put it on again, once again as a sign of respect at a funeral in an American prisoner of war camp for 2 of my best friends. During free time in the process, I listened to my fellow prisoners telling their stories. The men were between 19 and 40 years old and had been trained in vocational and technical schools. There were teachers, stonemasons, electricians, and all sorts of other professions. The Third Reich had abruptly ended the civilian jobs they were proud of. They knew they were lucky to have survived the Africa campaign, but they did not feel completely relieved. All their physical and mental energy had been spent on fighting, and now that they were idle, they felt worried, nostalgic, anxious, depressed, and angry in turns. Many had left their wives and children in Germany and were desperate about their fate. The men suffered from barbed wire disease, feeling powerless to help themselves, let alone their loved ones. Some of the oldest men were trying to compose themselves to console the others, feeling more nostalgic than ever before. We were trying to find friends who came from the same areas. Those who spoke the same dialect would know the same cities, heroes, folklore, and songs. I listened to the familiar pronunciation of my area and found my group there. We could stay in the same barracks together. I learned it in a talk at the end of our processing day. The camp commander told us, through an interpreter, that we should make the best of this situation. He explained the rules, the medical and dental services, and how to write and send letters home. He finished by explaining the punishment that would be imposed for escapes or attempted escapes. Isolation in the dungeon for a period of time that would be determined according to the type of crime. Then he dismissed us so we could look for our new homes. A man named Ralph, from Hamburg, a city near my hometown, was an older, quiet man who had been a teacher previously. We headed towards our new barracks, located somewhere in the group of black tar paper barracks. The camp was divided into 3 sections. Each precinct consisted of 20 barracks, as well as dining rooms, a workshop, a canteen, an infirmary, an administrative building, and a recreation room. A barack measured 20 feet by 100 feet and consisted of a concrete slab floor and a 2x4 wood frame covered in tar paper. The Army Corps of Engineers used this same plan in the 155 prisoner of war camps built. Ralph took a look at our barack. It is not the Hotel Waldorf Astoria, but since we're in a small town, we cannot expect much. Even so, I think we should book rooms. How funny that the most famous hotel in Nueva York was owned by a German immigrant named Waldorf. Do you think they offer room service? I couldn't help myself. We soon discovered that the locals who lived near those camps did not think we had anything to joke about. They thought we had it too good and called the prisoner of war camps the Fritz Ritz. Inside each barack, there were about 100 cots in rows with hooks along the wall to hang the clothes we had been given and our duffel bags. A cast-iron stove sat in the central hallway. Rolf and I found 2 empty cots next to each other there. After the few minutes it took us to put away our things, we dropped onto the cots. I looked at the ceiling and realized it was real. There I was, a teenager and prisoner of war, with a serial number and all. I thought about what my parents would expect of me in those circumstances. They were practical people who had lived through 2 wars and had never panicked at all. Both my sister and I had learned to deal with the conditions of war by following their example. But neither of my parents could have foreseen this outcome or prepared me for captivity. I couldn't shake that feeling. I sat on the edge of the bunk and stared into space. Take a look at this place. This came from Rolf directly. He was very old, about 35 years old, but he always surprised me with his energy, which felt contagious. He went outside, and I followed him then. We passed gravel paths and a wide flat area that led beyond our precinct's boundary. We could see 2 other precincts with about 20 barracks each from there. The precinct had a laundry room and an open field for inspections and sports activities. Beyond the fences, we could see the hospital, the chapel, and the U.S. Post Office. And what looked like a warehouse building. The camp was like any other military camp, but it had one important difference. We were surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire 10 feet high, and were watched from watchtowers with powerful spotlights to control us even better. A single barbed wire fence isolated the individual precincts. We could see the young military guards frowning at us and wondered how well-trained they were for that job. We joked about the fact that they looked like children. They had never left home before. I saw fear in their eyes when they looked at us then. They saw dangerous combatants, soldiers who would stop at nothing to kill or to escape. In reality, the only thing Rolf and I were fighting against was depression itself. We were prisoners of the enemy in the enemy's country, a situation that had never been contemplated in our military training manual. I decided to keep a cool head always. I wanted to go home to see my family again. I found it hard to understand or believe that the Americans were so generous with food, clothing, and lodging. I asked Ralph what he thought of it. He took his pipe and tobacco out of his pocket. I think they are practicing the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do to you, he said. He lit his pipe before continuing. You know there are American prisoners of war in Germany. Do you mean that the Americans hope that, if they treat us well, Germany will find out and do the same? I asked. Yes, I'm sure that's what I asked, he replied. It's mind-blowing. Obviously, they knew little about the SS, Hitler's private army that controlled the entire war effort. I was convinced that the atheists in the SS did not even know the golden rule. Leaving aside the atheists, we had other problems. The worst problem was the heat and humidity of Hearne, Texas. As privates, Rolf and I had very tough jobs. We had both grown up in the cool climate of the north coasts of Germany and Denmark. I had never gotten used to the hot days and cold nights of North Africa. I was surprised that this new prisoner of war camp in Texas was even hotter than North Africa. Hard work in the Texas sun was exhausting, but if I didn't work, I didn't get paid. The things that I could buy with the little money I earned each day meant a lot to me. A Coca-Cola, a chocolate bar, and cigarettes. I enjoyed them while reading the news from the outside world for free in the New York Times. My daily ordeal began at 5:30. At 6 o'clock, we were woken for breakfast, bread with jam and a strange food called cornflakes. In Germany, only animals ate corn. At 6:30, we shaved, showered, and cleaned the barracks. At 7:30, we took roll call and were assigned tasks. Hard physical work under a scorching sun, mowing, raking, and weeding the enormous terrain. At 12, lunch in the field with a brown bag. The typical menu was potato salad, roast pork, carrot sticks, and ice water. More hard work in the sun until departure time at 4:30. Many men collapsed from heat stroke and sheer exhaustion. Those of us who could still move had dinner at 6. The typical menu was meatloaf, scrambled eggs, milk, and bread. It wasn't exactly my mother's cooking, but at least my stomach was full for the first time in years. The scourge of the heat and the strong sun created a cottage industry, since the U.S. Army caps did not protect from the sun. Some of the men in my work group set up a small business, making wide caps from the thick cotton covers of our mattresses. Its design was original and practical. The hardest working soldiers placed orders and bought them with their own money. The caps gave us identity. I put mine on my head with an arrogant air. We were a resilient and resourceful group. I adapted to the heat. I was often one of the few men still standing at the end of the day. One day, I was rewarded with a task outside the camp fences, cutting weeds with a large, sharp scythe along the main road. I advanced until I reached an intersection, when a car approached and stopped. I looked back at my group, scattered on both sides of the road, some distance away. The guard was facing away from the road. An old man leaned out of the car window and called to me. "Hello, which way to the prisoner of war camp?" "Down the road right behind me," I replied in my best English, "and you might be interested to know that I am one of them." He looked at me in surprise and sped away, kicking up a shower of gravel. I looked down at my clothes, which had the word PW stamped in white in all visible places, and I couldn't help but laugh. That was my only moment of joy at work during those first hot days in the camp. The non-commissioned officers, from sergeant to lieutenant, received different treatment than the privates. The non-commissioned officers were in charge of the internal management of the camp and did not have to do any other work, unless they wanted to earn more than the $3 a week that was due to them. The non-commissioned officers dedicated themselves to all sorts of projects. To this day, you can find photographs in the military archives that testify to their ingenuity in the Herne camp. The non-commissioned officers designed and built a perfect scale model of one of King Ludwig II's Bavarian castles, with stairs and a functioning moat. They mixed and poured tons of donated cement and turned everyday objects into doors, windows, and ornaments. Both Germans and Americans admired the skill of these ingenious men who used their skills to stay mentally alert and physically active. Not all camp activities were so simple or benign. Most of the captive Germans were veterans hardened in the African campaign. Although Germany was suffering great losses on the Eastern Front and the air war over Germany had intensified, there was still strong loyalty to our homeland and government, as well as belief in victory. I had silently dismissed my belief in German victory after seeing the overwhelming amount of war material the Allies possessed in North Africa. My observations during the train journey from New York to Texas, passing through industrious cities during the day and completely illuminated at night, increased my skepticism. There were no blackouts here. The Americans were not worried about the bombings in Germany day and night. It was public knowledge that the Herne camp was one of the more than 150 camps to which the POWs were sent. In addition, we had heard that there were about 500 other camps. If the abundance of supplies in a small camp like Herne was usual, Germany was doomed. I often told myself that I was probably in the best place I could be under the circumstances. I could be starving or tortured or fighting in conditions that only God knew about. Then I saw the barbed wire fences around me, and I was not sure how much I hated that barbed wire. However, it never occurred to me to escape, even though I spoke English. Where could I go? Of course, I could not return to Germany. However, someone else tried to escape, probably out of a sense of duty. He was a tough guy, a fighter. He wore civilian clothes over his German uniform, but his military training gave him away, because as he walked along a rural road, he sang German marching songs to keep his spirits up. A farmer heard him and betrayed him. Some people deserve their fate. According to reports, less than 1% of the 360,000 German prisoners of war escaped. Most fugitives were captured in less than 24 hours. The large camps did not experience more than 3 or 4 escapes during the war. The high military commands in Washington, D.C. were glad not to have to face the chaos of hundreds of thousands of uncontrollable individuals, but with an obedient and cohesive military unit in which each rank was responsible to its direct superior for its actions. This disciplinary tactic seemed right to our captors, but it led to a disastrous strengthening of German militarism and Nazism within the camps. We had access to war news through the New York Times, which published communiques from the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union. Over time, I began to get closer to the truth. There were exaggerations of successes and losses, and setbacks were minimized on both sides. I remember my Uncle Hani listening to the radio in Germany and telling me an old saying, "The first victim of war is the truth," on the days we did not receive the newspaper. Rolf and I speculated about the reason for its absence. "The Allies must have suffered a setback," said Rolf. Or, "Our side must have won a battle." For a change, the only news worth anything came from my family, now that we were allowed to send letters through the International Red Cross. I wrote to my parents in care of Kiel on airmail forms, similar to today's light paper forms. My mother answered me immediately, as she knew that the letters took months to arrive. Both sides censored the mail. Some crossed out words, and others cut them out. The only thing that usually remained were the greetings and personal information. My mother's letters were always cheerful and encouraging.